So last year, when I made a video about my Unify home network, I mentioned that even after 2 years, I wasn't gonna upgrade anything because everything was working great. Well, more than a year has passed since that video, and although it's still been working great, I just couldn't resist upgrading a few things. In my last video, I upgraded my non-Unify 10 gig switch to the Unify switch aggregation. And in this video, I'm gonna talk about my latest upgrade. This thing, the Unify Dream Router, which just may be the only Unify device that most people need. Hi everyone, welcome to another Tech Talk with Samir, where I talk about anything and everything related to technology in my life. So I keep saying this over and over again, but Unify is like a black hole. Once you dip your toes into the ecosystem, you get sucked right in, and I'm definitely a victim of this. So when I first got into the Unify ecosystem, all I was looking for was a way to have multiple access points for my home to have even coverage throughout the house. I initially just hooked up the access points to the Asus router I had at the time, and it did exactly what I needed it to do. But to even set up the access points, I needed to install the Unify controller on a computer on the network. After you set up the controller and start digging around, you get hooked onto all the beautiful visualizations with different stats and graphs within the controller interface. The other thing that becomes very apparent very quickly is how much more you can potentially see within the interface if you had compatible Unify devices. And that's how they get you. So I went ahead and got a Unify PoE switch so that I didn't have to use the PoE injectors for the access points. Then I decided to get a 24 port switch because I wanted to wire up more of my devices. Then I found out that to do firewall configurations within the controller, you need to have a Unify router. So I ended up replacing my Asus router altogether with an Unify router, the Unify Security Gateway, or USG for short. That completed my chain of Unify devices. I had my routers, switches, and access points all switched over to Unify devices. And I bet I'm not the only one that went through this chain of events. So what if there was one device that kind of consolidated all of these things? Well, here it is. This is the Unify Dream Router. This box is actually empty. I actually took it out and have been using it for a few days now, but let's pretend it's still in there. Long story short, this is a router, a switch, and an access point all in one device. But you might say, hey Samir, the little modem from my internet provider is also all three of those things in one device, on top of being a modem. To you, I say, yeah, you're absolutely right. But you're also probably one of those people that are complaining about how bad your Wi-Fi is at home. Let's face it, the all-in-one modems that your ISP provides aren't exactly the best devices and are generally quite limited in functionality. This device, on the other hand, opens up a whole world of possibilities. Some are probably beyond what you need for your home. The UDR just recently became available for purchase, and I was lucky enough to order one before it totally sold out. It costs $200, but some people were able to get it for around $80 when it was offered as an early access product a while back. But as you'll see, even at $200, this thing might be a steal compared to other Unify alternatives. Out of the box, you get just the UDR itself along with a power cable. I'm actually pretty surprised by how compact the UDR is. Honestly, looking at the photos on the website, I thought this was physically a lot bigger than it actually is. I think it's because I expected the footprint to resemble their access points, but it's definitely a much smaller footprint. Looking at the UDR itself, you have a small LCD display in the front. As I mentioned in my last video, Unify is adding these small screens to many of their devices to show you things like throughput and some other information. It can be handy for troubleshooting from time to time, but it's not a screen that you'll be looking at too often. Also, the screen on the UDR is not a touchscreen unlike the one from my switch from my last video. On the back of the UDR, you have 5 Rj45 ports. One of them is your WAN input, so that's where you'll be plugging in the connection from your ISP's modem. The other 4 ports are basically a 4-port switch, and 2 out of the 4 ports are actually power over Ethernet, specifically 802.11af PoE. So you can use it to power a couple of access points or cameras if you have devices compatible with that standard of PoE. Right above the Rj45 ports, you have a microSD slot. This is actually to store video footage for their security cameras through Unify Protect if you open up that can of worms. Now, the UDR does have 128 gigabytes of built-in storage, so you don't necessarily need to put in a card in there. But as we all know, video footage can take up a lot of space, so 128 gigs might not be enough if you plan on having 24/7 recording. However, it might be enough for just motion triggered recording for a couple of cameras. One thing to note is that even if you add a micro SD card, it doesn't exactly expand on the onboard storage. It's just one or the other. So if you put in another 128 gig micro SD card, it's not gonna give you 256 gigs of storage in total. You'll still only have 128 gigs of usable space. So if you're planning on using a micro SD card, make sure to get one that's larger than 128 gigs. Currently, I'm not using any UniFi cameras to test out UniFi Protect, but I do plan on switching my Ring doorbell to an UniFi doorbell eventually, so this may come in handy for me down the road. Looking at the top of the UDR, I believe this is where the access point antenna is located. It's dome-shaped with a blue ring light surrounding it, similar to their ceiling mount access points but much smaller. The built-in access point is capable of Wi-Fi 6 with 4x4 MIMO technology. If I'm just reading the spec sheet, it seems similar to their UniFi 6 long-range access point, but I don't have one of those to compare to, so we'll just have to test this out by itself to see how it performs. Overall, the UDR looks a bit like smart home speakers similar to Apple's HomePod, and it's definitely something you can potentially put in your living room. But on the other hand, you can't really wall mount it or rack mount it. So it's basically catered more towards people that want to keep it in the open rather than someone like me who intends on hiding it in a closet. And you probably should keep it in the open to maximize the Wi-Fi range from the UDR. By the way, this isn't the first device UniFi has made with this type of form factor. The original Dream Machine was also like this. Let's go ahead and hook this up and configure everything. Since I have an existing UniFi router and controller in my environment, what I'm going to do is migrate everything over to the UDR so that all my settings and configurations remain the same. To do that, I first had to make a backup of my existing controller, which is just the software installed on a Windows computer. One thing to keep in mind is that if there's a mismatch of the controller versions from the old one to the new one, there might be issues restoring the backup later. So it's always best to update your controller before doing the backup. Once I had the backup, it was time to wire up the UDR for the initial setup. Now, you can take apart your existing setup and just connect everything the way it's eventually gonna be, but that will take down your network for however long it takes you to configure. The least intrusive way to do this is to connect the WAN port of the UDR to a LAN port of your existing network and connect the computer you'll be using to set up to one of the LAN ports of the UDR. This way, the UDR still gets internet from your current network during the setup without interrupting your current network. After getting the UDR physically connected and powered on, it's just a matter of opening up a browser and going to the IP address 192.168.1 and 1. After that, just follow the prompts on the screen to do the initial setup. Along the way, it does ask you if you want to restore from a backup, but you can also skip it and do it at a later time from the settings, which is what I did because I wanted to see what the initial setup process looks like. So after the initial setup, you get to what UniFi calls Unify OS. Within Unify OS, the network controller is an app that runs on it, along with Protect, which is their security camera system controller, Talk, which is their voice over IP controller, and Access, which is their physical access controller. Now, if I were to make a bet, I don't think anyone will be getting this device to use for Talk and Access, but it's there for anyone that wants to try. One thing to keep in mind is that you can only have 2 of these applications running at the same time. And my guess is that for most people, it will just be Network and maybe Protect. Anyways, going back to the network controller, the first thing you should do is check for updates. Because like I said earlier, a mismatch in versions between the old controller and the UDR might cause some issues while restoring. Once everything is up to date, it's just a matter of restoring from the backup we took from the old controller. After the restore, the IP address of the UDR will actually change to the previous router's IP address. So the page might not refresh on its own because the default IP address is no longer valid. Unless of course if your old router's IP address was also the default one. At this time, go ahead and disconnect your current router and controller and wire up the UDR in the place of your old router. So the WAN port goes to your modem and the LAN ports connect to everything else downstream. After that, if you use your old router's IP address on a browser, you should be able to log into the controller again and everything should pick right back up exactly how it was with your old controller. Let's talk about performance. One issue I had with the old USG was that if I turned on intrusion detection and prevention, I couldn't get the advertised speeds from my internet provider. Because of this, I had to keep those settings turned off. On the UDR, however, I get full speeds. Turning on those settings didn't have any effect on my internet performance at all. Now, keep in mind, I only have 350 megabit internet connection, so I'm not exactly pushing too many limits. However, I did read online that some people with gigabit internet was experiencing some performance issues. So if you're someone with gigabit internet, it's possible that you might sacrifice some speeds with the intrusion detection and prevention turned on. But if your internet speeds are similar to mine, the UDR will not be limiting your speeds if you have those settings turned on. When it comes to Wi-Fi, like I said before, the UDR does have a built-in access point. Well, the only way I could really test this was by disconnecting my other access points and seeing the range and throughput I get with just the UDR itself. Now keep in mind, my UDR is located in a closet which is closed off from the rest of the house with doors and walls, so it's not exactly an ideal location to do range tests. That being said, whatever results I get, the chances are that a more practical placement will probably get better results. So I used Unify's Wi-Fi Man mobile app to do this test. It uses AR to map out a heat map of the Wi-Fi strength as you walk around the house. And I was actually quite surprised at how usable the signal strength was even at the most extreme locations within the house. I live in a relatively large 2-story house, so it's not exactly ideal to use just one access point for a house like this. But even then, the UDR performed very well. Even the throughput was fine for casual use wherever the signal was the lowest. One thing to keep in mind is that my phone is connecting using the 5 GHz band, so it's not as good at penetrating walls as 2.4 GHz. That being said, with 2.4 GHz, you're likely to get more interference. So factor that in if you're trying to evaluate how this will perform in terms of range and throughput in your home. But overall, I think for a lot of people, the UDR might just be enough for Wi-Fi coverage, especially if they live in an apartment or a smaller house. So what's going to be the role of the UDR in my setup? Well, my goal was to consolidate some of my devices to simplify my network. Previously, I had the USG for my router, I had the controller running on a Windows computer, and I had a small PoE switch to power my access points. And with the UDR, I'm able to consolidate all 3 of these functionalities in just one device. Like I said, the UDR has 2 PoE LAN ports, so I'm just connecting my access points to that. By the way, I can only do that because my access points support 802.11af PoE, so depending on your access points, you may still need to buy a separate PoE switch or PoE injectors. So my network currently looks like this. I have my ISP's router going into the WAN port of the UDR. Then I have my 2 access points connecting to the UDR directly using the PoE ports. Then I have my 24-port switch connecting to one of the other LAN ports on the UDR. Most of my wired LAN devices connect to this switch. And from the 24-port switch, I have an SFP connection connecting to my 10 gig switch for all my 10 gig devices. And that's it. My home network setup went from having 6 core components to just 4 by switching to the UDR. My modem, the UDR, the 24-port switch, and my 10 gig switch. However, my setup isn't exactly what the average person will need. For the average person, getting just the UDR might be enough for their networking needs. You have the router, a seemingly impressive access point, a built-in network controller, and some Ethernet ports. It's a great starting point to get into Unify, and the flexibility will be there for anyone looking to expand within the Unify ecosystem. For those looking for a more prosumer type of router device, Unify has a few other options like the Dream Machine Pro and the Dream Machine Pro SE and their new UXG Pro. But those are significantly more expensive and they require separate access points to even get started with Wi-Fi. They're basically geared towards people that are either network enthusiasts or IT admins for small businesses. Even the original Unify Dream Machine is priced $100 more than the UDR, and that thing is actually not as feature packed as this one. So for majority of the people looking for home setups, the UDR just might be the best Unify device for their needs. By the way, I'm not a network engineer, so I'm basically just learning all of this stuff on the fly. So if you have any suggestions on anything I could do better with my Unify setup, leave them in the comments below. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the thumbs up button for the YouTube algorithm. This is a very small channel and every bit of your support goes a long way. As always, stay safe and I'll see you again on the next one.